I can hear the objections now. But Biden was duly elected to the nomination by the American people. You can't just sub him out and put in the candidate you prefer. That's undemocratic. What about our democracy? What about it? Did you find it? Where's it been hiding this whole time? Let's take a look at some examples of Democrats not caring about democracy. Number 1, Democratic presidential primaries. There was all sorts of mishigas to keep Bernie from winning the nomination 4 years ago. The Iowa caucuses, and then Nevada, and there was the bullshit with the superdelegates. In fact, there have been reports that the superdelegates were plotting this year to step in if Bernie was in lead and block him from getting the nomination. But it didn't come to that. This year the Democrats were at it again, though. The Iowa caucuses were a hot mess. After Joe Biden's surprising turnaround on Super Tuesday, Jim Clyburn said that the rest of the primaries should be canceled, even though more than half the country hadn't voted yet. That's right, a black man from the South didn't think it was necessary for Democrats to be allowed to vote anymore. Around mid-March, I was very naive. I thought because there was a pandemic starting to spiral out of control, all primaries and caucuses would be postponed until they could be held safely. Silly me, I thought Democrats cared about democracy. Starting March 17th, Super Tuesday Part 3, primaries kept taking place. Tom Perez famously went on with Chris Hayes and appeared to lie about it being safe for people to vote in person when it was not. The pandemic provided a pretext for Republicans to close polling places, thereby cramming even more people into fewer locations. A lot of poll workers are old, many didn't show up, which meant that voters had to wait even longer in already crowded polling places. But since Tom Perez's preferred candidate had become the frontrunner, it was important to keep the primaries moving along. His excuse was, primaries are put on by state parties. All he could do was encourage them to adopt vote by mail. Are you telling me that the chair of the National Party can't make a phone call to all the state parties and say, postpone your primaries or else? The opposite happened. States were threatened with the loss of delegates if they did the right thing and postponed. So inevitably, stories started coming out about poll workers and voters testing positive for the virus. You'd think it would be criminal for such a powerful person as Tom Perez to put everyone in danger. There were calls from the left for him to resign, but that went nowhere, of course, because it came from the left. Example number 2 of Democrats not caring about democracy, voter suppression. Now, if you're like me, you've always thought voter suppression is something that Republicans do, and Democrats are trying to stop it. Well, first of all, it turns out that the Democrats also do voter suppression, but because they're Democrats, they do it in the dumbest possible way. They don't do it against the enemy, Republicans, they do it against their own voters. For example, the Democratic overlords in the state of New York schedule primaries on different dates intentionally to depress turnout among low propensity voters who tend to prefer progressive candidates. There was also that recent plot in New York to kick Bernie off the primary ballot. The idea was, if he wasn't on the ballot, then his supporters would be less likely to turn out and vote for progressive candidates in down-ballot races. In this case, the Democrats were stopped by the courts, so there, a little victory for democracy. On April 29th of this year, I received a mysterious email from something called Roots Action. I don't know what that is, but I somehow got onto their mailing list. The subject of the email was, Prevent Theft of Bernie Delegates in California. It said, the California Democratic Party chair, Rusty Hicks, is under pressure to prevent the allocation of statewide delegates to Bernie in proportion to the support that voters gave him in the March 3rd primary across our state. Chairman Hicks is under establishment pressure to decide that Bernie Sanders will not receive the substantial proportion of at-large and other delegates that party rules provide for due to vote totals in California. That could mean denying the Bernie 2020 campaign many dozens of delegates to the National Convention on the basis of faulty claims that he is no longer a qualifying candidate. I was just looking online, I didn't see anything about this, I don't know what happened with all of it, but it's absolutely plausible that the Democratic establishment would do something like this. It's like retroactive voter suppression. Maybe because California is a blue state, we were allowed to have an authentic voting experience on election day, and then a few months later, the votes got thrown out. All the presidential primaries held March 17th onward are examples of Democratic voter suppression against Democrats as well. The state parties and the national party did not have the mindset that every member of the party has the right to vote, and vote safely. Instead, their approach was, oh, did you want to exercise your constitutional right to vote? Fine, but you're going to have to risk your life to do it. You take your life in your hands if you want to vote in this democracy. In all the zombie primaries held during the pandemic, the Democratic establishment actually benefited from the voter suppression infrastructure that the Republicans already had in place. It's designed to keep Democrats from voting in general elections, which benefits Republicans, but in primaries, low turnout among Democrats favors conservative candidates. Just like Tom Perez in March, Joe Biden went on TV the day before the Wisconsin primary and assured everyone that it was perfectly safe to vote in person when it was not. And then after everyone had voted on election day, he went on TV again and said it was most definitely not safe, but it was those mean Republicans in Wisconsin who forced everyone to vote anyway. The Democrats should be careful what they wish for. They don't care if any of us vote in the primaries, but we better vote in the general election, right? But the same mechanisms that kept turnout low in primaries will be in full effect for the general election. And again, the Republicans will have the pretext of the pandemic to close even more polling places. Democrats don't win general elections when turnout is low. Now, conventional wisdom is that red state voter suppression is the Republicans' doing, and theirs alone. They made it happen. They are responsible. Although Democratic voters are most likely to be disenfranchised, the Democratic Party brain trust has somehow avoided all blame. I disagree. It happened on their watch. There are only two major parties in this country. This has been going on forever. It's not new. It's not a secret. And what has the Democrats' response been? They let every branch of government fall under the control of Republicans at every level of government. The Democratic Party has stood by and done nothing, while its own voters have been systematically disenfranchised in red states. Our final example of Democrats not caring about democracy is presidential elections. Here's an interesting statistic. During my lifetime, there have been 9 presidential elections. The Democrat has won the popular vote 6 times, or 66% of the time. However, a Republican has been president 55% of that time. Weird. It's like the American people keep choosing a Democrat, but then a Republican becomes president anyway, like in a complete subversion of the will of the people and of democracy itself. Of course, we don't end up with a president every 4 years because of democracy. It's been sheer coincidence that the popular vote and the electoral college vote usually line up. But that's the problem, and is one that the Democrats should have corrected after the shit show in 2000. If the opposite had happened, George W. Bush winning the popular vote and Al Gore winning the electoral college, the Republicans would have gotten on the floor and thrown a temper tantrum and said, this will never ever happen to one of our candidates again. And they would have gotten rid of the electoral college because Republicans do stuff. And Jesus help us if Donald Trump had won the popular vote in 2016 and Hillary Clinton had won the electoral college. We would probably be engulfed in another civil war right now. But because the injustice happened to the Democrats, they just threw up their hands and said, what are you going to do? We have to respect the will of the voters. We have to have a peaceful transfer of power. It's for the good of the country. And both times, we got stuck with a sociopathic, Republican simpleton for a president who took a blowtorch to the Constitution and the Geneva Conventions and did far more damage to our democracy than a protracted court battle would have done in the year 2000. But the Democrats just don't care. If they did, they would have fought like hell in 2000 to get every vote in Florida counted. And then they would have said, from this point on, the Democratic Party's #1 priority is abolishing the Electoral College, whether it's by constitutional amendment or by some other workaround because Republicans will block the amendment. What happened to our voters is unacceptable. The American people chose Al Gore. The Electoral College chose a lunatic. The mechanism that was supposed to protect us from the lunatic failed. This will not happen again on our watch. But of course the Democrats didn't say that, and it did happen again. Apparently the National Interstate Voting Compact, whatever it's called, started in the mid-2000s. I never even heard of it until after the election in 2016. Maybe because the name sucks. Or maybe because the Democrats never made a big deal about it. What happened in 2000 and 2016 is going to happen again. Democratic voters outnumber Republican voters by the millions nationwide. That gap is only going to widen as each subsequent generation becomes more and more progressive. As long as we keep having presidential elections that go state by state, there's always the possibility that the Republican can win while receiving fewer votes than the Democrat. Al Gore received just under 51 million votes in the year 2000. Hillary Clinton received a little under 66 million votes 4 years ago. That's nearly 117 million votes. If you voted in either of those elections or both, you should be upset that your vote got thrown away by the Democratic Party. It's in the trash right now, along with the hanging chads. I think we can also proactively add this year's presidential election to our list. If the Democrats actually cared, they would have demanded that Congress fully fund voting by mail in every state for every voter. It's like August. The states are kind of running out of time to get that set up, but the Democrats are not fighting for it. If anybody says that forcing the Democratic Party to make Bernie Sanders the nominee is undemocratic, who cares? At this point, it's only the left that's still adhering to the mandate of democracy. The Democrats and the Republicans gave up on it a long time ago, and they're the ones with all the power.